He never expected that a simple act of kindness would change his life forever. What started as just another day for wealthy businessman Richard Thompson turned into a moment that would shake him to his very core. As he walked out of his favorite restaurant with a takeout bag in hand, he noticed a small boy sitting on the curb, looking at passers-by with hungry eyes. Something about the child's expression made Richard stop in his tracks. Those eyes held a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. Little did Richard know, this chance encounter would unravel a truth so shocking that it would completely transform his understanding of family, fate, and the mysterious ways life sometimes connects people who were always meant to find each other. The streets were bustling with the usual afternoon crowd, business people rushing to meetings, tourists snapping photos, and locals going about their day. Richard had just closed a major deal worth millions and was treating himself to a meal from Luigi's, the most exclusive Italian restaurant in the city. He could have dined in, of course, but sometimes even a billionaire needed a moment of solitude. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the contrast between his world and the one before him couldn't have been more stark. A small boy, no older than 7, sat huddled against the building, his clothes worn and his face smudged with dirt. What caught Richard's attention wasn't just the boy's obvious poverty, but the dignity with which he sat there, not begging, not crying, just waiting. For what? Richard couldn't tell, but something made him slow his steps. The child looked up, and their eyes met for a brief moment that somehow felt significant, like a photograph being taken of a moment that would later prove important. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked before he could stop himself, surprising even himself with the direct question. The boy nodded silently, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. There was something strangely familiar about the child that Richard couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was just the universal vulnerability of childhood, or maybe it was something more, a connection he couldn't yet understand. "Here," Richard said, holding out the bag containing his gourmet pasta and freshly baked bread. "I'm not that hungry anyway." This wasn't true, of course. Richard had been looking forward to this meal, but suddenly it seemed insignificant compared to the need before him. The boy hesitated, pride battling hunger in his expressive eyes. "It's okay," Richard assured him with a gentle smile. "Really? I insist." Finally, the child reached out and took the bag, the paper crinkling loudly in the space between them. His small hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or emotion, Richard couldn't tell. What happened next would haunt Richard for days to come. Instead of immediately tearing into the food as expected, the small boy carefully set the bag aside, closed his eyes, and folded his hands in prayer. Richard stood frozen, an unexpected witness to this private moment of gratitude. He was about to turn away to give the child privacy when he heard his own name fall from the boy's lips. "Thank you, God, for sending Mr. Richard Thompson to help me today," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the city noise. "Just like my mom." "I said you would." Richard felt his blood run cold. How did this child know his full name? He had never introduced himself. The boy continued praying, oblivious to Richard's shock, thanking God for the food and asking blessings for his mother, who was up in heaven now. Richard's mind raced with questions. Who was this child? How did he know Richard's name? And why? Did his mother tell him that Richard, specifically, would help him? Something wasn't adding up, and Richard felt a strange mixture of curiosity and dread forming in the pit of his stomach. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice barely steady, as the boy finished his prayer and looked up at him with those hauntingly familiar eyes. The child seemed surprised by Richard's continued presence, as if he expected the wealthy man to have walked away by now. "My name is Michael," the boy replied softly. "Michael Davis." The surname hit Richard like a physical blow. Davis. The bah. Same last name as Sarah, his college sweetheart from 15 years ago, the woman he'd once planned to marry before his ambition and her dreams of humanitarian work had pulled them in different directions. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. "How old are you, Michael?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I'll be 8 next month," the boy answered, his fingers nervously playing with the paper bag. Richard did the mental math quickly. The timing aligned perfectly with when he and Sarah had parted ways. A cold realization began to dawn on him, sending chills down his spine despite the warm spring day. "Where do you live, Michael?" Richard continued gently, crouching down to the boy's level. The business meeting he was supposed to attend in 30 minutes no longer seemed important. Michael hesitated, the wariness of a child who had learned to be careful with strangers evident in his expression. "At the Sunshine Children's Home," he finally admitted. "Since Mom went to heaven 3 months ago." Richard felt his heart constrict, painfully in his chest. Sarah was dead, and their son, for he was becoming increasingly certain that's who this child was, had ended up in an orphanage. The thought was unbearable. "Did your mother ever talk about your father?" Richard asked, his mouth dry with anticipation and fear. Michael nodded slowly, his small face brightening slightly. "She said he was a good man who didn't know about me," the boy explained with the simple acceptance that only children can manage. "She said he was very smart and was going to change the world with his ideas. She kept his picture with her always." Richard felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. That sounded exactly like something Sarah would say, always seeing the best in him, even when he didn't deserve it. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, folded photograph, handling it with the reverence of someone holding a precious treasure. "This is her and my dad," he said, carefully unfolding it and handing it to Richard. With trembling fingers, Richard accepted the photograph, already knowing what he would see. There they were, a younger version of himself with his arm around Sarah, both of them laughing on the university campus, the autumn leaves creating a golden backdrop. He remembered the day perfectly. It was when he had received news of his first business plan winning a prestigious competition. Sarah had been so proud, her belief in him unwavering even then. Richard stared at the image, unable to speak. The evidence was undeniable. This hungry child sitting on the street, this boy who had just prayed using his name, was his son. A son he never knew existed. A son who had been orphaned and alone while Richard had been accumulating wealth and power, oblivious to his existence. The realization was devastating and transformative all at once, like watching a building collapse while standing inside it. "Your mother was right about me, Michael," Richard finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Richard Thompson." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief and wonder. "Are you really the man from Mom's picture? The one she told stories about?" Richard nodded, unable to trust his voice for a moment. How had fate brought them together like this? What were the odds that on this particular day, he would choose to get takeout from this specific restaurant at the exact time Michael happened? To be sitting outside? It seemed impossible. Yet here they were. "Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago," Richard explained gently. "She was the kindest, smartest person I ever knew." Michael nodded eagerly. "That's what everyone says about her. She was a doctor and helped people all over the world." Richard wasn't surprised. That had always been Sarah's dream, to use her medical skills where they were most needed. While he had been building his fortune, she had been saving lives, and apparently raising their son alone. The thought filled him with a complex mixture of admiration, regret, and grief. The next few hours passed in a blur as Richard cancelled all his meetings and took Michael to his penthouse apartment. The boy's eyes grew wide as they rode the private elevator to the top floor, his small hand clutching Richard's as if afraid this might all disappear. Richard couldn't stop staring at him, seeing Sarah in the shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile, but also recognizing his own features, the set of the jaw, the thoughtful furrow of the brow when considering something important. How had he not noticed these similarities immediately? Now they seemed so obvious that it physically hurt to look at the child. "Is this all yours?" Michael asked in awe as they entered the expansive living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Richard nodded, suddenly seeing his home through new eyes, the cold, minimalist design, the absence of family photos or children's toys, the sterile perfection that spoke of wealth but not warmth. "It is," he replied. "But I think it needs something." Michael looked at him questioningly. "What?" the boy asked. Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "Life," he answered simply. "It needs life." Richard ordered every kind of food he could think a child might like: pizza, burgers, ice cream, cookies, creating an impromptu feast that covered his rarely used dining table. As Michael ate with the hearty appetite of a growing boy who had known hunger, Richard made phone calls. First to his lawyer, to begin the process of proving paternity and gaining custody. Then to his assistant, canceling his meetings for the rest of the week, something he had never done before. Finally, to a childhood friend who now worked in family services, asking for help in navigating the system and bringing Michael home as soon as possible. Throughout these calls, Richard kept his eyes on Michael, afraid that if he looked away, the boy might vanish like a dream. "You don't have to do all this," Michael said between bites of pizza, his intuition surprising for someone so young. "Mom always said you were busy changing the world." Richard felt a lump form in his throat at these words, at the grace Sarah had shown in explaining his absence to their son. "The world can wait," he replied firmly. "Some things are more important." And as he said it, Richard realized with perfect clarity that it was true. All his wealth, his companies, his influence. What did any of it mean if he wasn't using it to care for his own child? The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings, visits to the children's home, and shopping trips to buy everything Michael might need. Richard learned that Sarah had died of complications from pneumonia contracted while working at a refugee camp in Sudan. She had arranged for Michael to be sent back to the States, to the city where she and Richard had met, perhaps hoping that somehow, someday, father and son would find each other. It seemed impossible that their reunion had happened so randomly, yet so perfectly, through a simple act of sharing food. Richard couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had somehow orchestrated it from beyond, her final act of love for both of them. The social workers were initially skeptical of Richard's sudden appearance and claims, but DNA tests quickly confirmed what he already knew in his heart. Michael was undeniably his son. What surprised Richard most during this process was how quickly he fell in love with the boy, not just because of his connection to Sarah, or even because of their biological bond, but because Michael was simply an extraordinary child, resilient, kind, and wise beyond his years. "Will I really get to live with you forever?" Michael asked one evening, as Richard tucked him into bed in the newly decorated bedroom of the penthouse. The walls, once stark white, were now painted a warm blue, and stars glowed on the ceiling when the lights were turned off. Toys and books filled the shelves, and photographs of Sarah that Richard had managed to collect were displayed prominently, ensuring her presence would remain in her son's life. "Forever and ever," Richard promised, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I've missed 8 years already. I don't plan to miss another minute." Michael considered this solemnly, then reached out to touch Richard's face, a gesture so innocent and trusting that it nearly broke Richard's heart. "Mom was right about you," the boy said sleepily. "She said you had a good heart, even if you didn't always know it." Richard swallowed hard, wondering for the 1,000th time how Sarah could have been so forgiving, so understanding, when he had chosen ambition over their relationship, never knowing she was carrying their child. He made a silent vow then, not just to Michael but to Sarah's memory, that he would become the man she had always believed he could be. The transformation in Richard's life was as complete as it was unexpected. Board members were shocked when he began leaving meetings promptly at 5 to make it home for dinner. Business associates raised eyebrows when he turned down international trips that would take him away for more than a day or two. His executive assistant nearly fainted when he announced he would be working from home on Wednesdays to attend Michael's soccer games. The billionaire who had once been known for his ruthless business tactics and single-minded focus on profit now had a new priority, and everyone in his orbit could feel the shift. Some criticized the change, suggesting he was losing his edge. Others admired his newfound humanity. Richard himself couldn't care less what anyone thought. For the first time in his life, he understood what true wealth was, and it had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account. It was in Michael's laughter as they played catch in the park, in the proud smile when he mastered a difficult math problem, in the peaceful expression on his face as he slept soundly, finally secure in the knowledge that he was home. One evening, about 6 months after they had found each other, Richard and Michael sat on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold and pink. Michael had adapted to his new life with remarkable resilience, though he still spoke of his mother often and sometimes cried for her at night. On this particular evening, he seemed thoughtful, his small legs swinging as he sat on the oversized chair. "Dad?" he asked, the word still new and precious to Richard's ears. "Yes, buddy," Richard replied, setting aside his tablet where he'd been reviewing company reports. "Do you think Mom can see us from heaven? Do you think she knows we found each other?" The question pierced Richard's heart with its innocence and depth. He looked at his son's upturned face, so trusting and open, waiting for an answer that would make sense of the universe. Richard wasn't a religious man. His faith had always been in what he could build with his own hands and mind. But loving Michael, and by extension, honoring Sarah's memory, had opened him to possibilities he'd never considered before. "I think she knows," he said finally, his voice soft but certain. "I think maybe she helped us find each other." Michael nodded, satisfied with this answer, in the way that children often are when adults confirm what they already believed. "That's what I think too," he said, leaning against Richard's side. "Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I can almost hear her telling me that everything will be okay now." Richard wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders, drawing him closer as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about the incredible sequence of events that had brought them together. His spontaneous decision to get takeout that day, Michael happening to be sitting outside that particular restaurant, the boy's prayer that had mentioned Richard by name. Was it all just coincidence, or was there something more at work? Richard had built his fortune on logic and calculation, on seeing patterns where others saw chaos, and the pattern here seemed undeniable. Someone or something had wanted them to find each other. Whether it was Sarah's spirit, divine intervention, or simply the mysterious workings of a universe more complex than humans could comprehend, Richard couldn't say. But he was profoundly grateful for whatever forces had brought his son into his life. The foundation came next, a natural evolution of Richard's changing perspective. Named after Sarah, it funded medical clinics in underserved areas around the world, continuing the work she had been passionate about. Michael was involved from the beginning, attending board meetings after school, offering his uniquely childlike but often surprisingly insightful input on decisions. Richard watched with pride as his son developed the same compassion and global awareness that had defined Sarah, combined with the strategic thinking and leadership qualities he had inherited from his father. Together, they were creating a legacy far more meaningful than Richard could have built alone. The story of how they found each other, through a simple meal shared with a stranger, became something of a legend among their friends and colleagues. Richard never tired of telling it, of describing that moment when he heard his name in a small boy's prayer and felt the universe shift beneath his feet. He had given food to a hungry child, a small act of kindness that had seemed insignificant. At the time, in return, he had received the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to know and love his son, and through him, to keep a part of Sarah alive in the world. Years passed, and Michael grew from a thoughtful child into a remarkable young man. At 16, he was already taking advanced placement classes and volunteering at one of the foundation's local clinics on weekends. Richard, now in his 50s, had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his companies to focus on philanthropic work and, more importantly, on being present for his son. They had settled into a comfortable routine, their initial awkwardness long since replaced by the easy familiarity of family. On the anniversary of the day they found each other, they always returned to Luigi's, ordering takeout and sitting on the curb outside, remembering how their lives had changed in an instant. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Michael asked during one of these commemorations, unwrapping his pasta primavera, the same dish Richard had given him years ago. Richard considered the question carefully, as he did all of Michael's questions. "I don't think I could have walked past you," he said finally. "Something would have made me stop. I believe we were meant to find each other." Michael nodded thoughtfully, twirling pasta around his fork. "I think so too," he agreed. "Mom always said that love finds a way." That night, as they walked home through the city streets, Richard reflected on the incredible journey they had shared. From strangers to family, from a chance encounter to an unbreakable bond. He thought about how close he had come to missing it all, how easily he could have taken a different route that day, or decided to dine in rather than get takeout, or simply walked past the small boy on the curb as hundreds of others had done. The thought made him shudder even now, years later. "Cold?" Michael asked, noticing his reaction. Richard shook his head, smiling at his perceptive son. "Just thinking about how fortunate I am," he replied honestly. Michael rolled his eyes good-naturedly, accustomed to his father's moments of sentimentality. "You're getting soft in your old age, Dad," he teased. Richard laughed, throwing an arm around his son's shoulders, now nearly level with his own. "Maybe so," he admitted, "but I think it suits me." And it did. The man who had once measured success in dollars and deals now counted it in moments. In soccer games attended, in homework helped with, in conversations that stretched late into the night, in the growing confidence and character of the young man beside him. The most unexpected outcome of finding Michael had been the way it changed how Richard approached his business empire. Where once he had pursued growth and profit above all else, he now evaluated every decision through the lens of its impact on people's lives. Was he creating the kind of world he wanted Michael to inherit? Was he using his influence in ways that would make Sarah proud? These questions transformed his companies from within, leading to initiatives in sustainable energy, ethical supply chains, and employee welfare that set new standards for the industry. Competitors who had once feared Richard's cutthroat tactics now found themselves trying to keep up with his innovative approaches to corporate responsibility. "You've revolutionized the way business thinks about success," a journalist told him during an interview for a major financial magazine. Richard shook his head modestly. "I just expanded the definition of profit," he explained. "Some returns can't be measured in quarterly reports." The journalist looked skeptical, pressing for more. "And what inspired this philosophical shift?" she asked. Richard smiled, thinking of a hungry boy's prayer and a photograph kept safe through years of hardship. "Let's just say I received an unexpected inheritance," he answered. "The kind that makes you rich in ways money never could." As Michael's high school graduation approached, bringing with it college decisions and thoughts of the future, Richard found himself reflecting more and more on the miraculous chain of events that had brought them together. One evening, as they sat reviewing university brochures spread across the dining table, Richard broached a subject that had been on his mind lately. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his coffee mug, "about starting a new program through the foundation." Michael looked up, interested. Richard's ideas were always worth listening to. "What kind of program?" he asked. Richard leaned forward, his expression animated in the way it always was when he was passionate about something. "One that helps connect separated families, children who've lost parents with relatives who might not even know they exist." The parallels to their own story were obvious. And Michael nodded slowly, understanding immediately. Using DNA databases, he suggested, already thinking practically. Richard smiled at his son's quick grasp of the concept. That, and other methods, he confirmed. Social media outreach, dedicated caseworkers, legal support. Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. We could call it Sarah's Bridge, he said finally, his voice soft with emotion. Richard felt his throat tighten at the perfect simplicity of the name. Yes, he agreed. Sarah's Bridge, connecting what was meant to be connected. Together they began drafting the outline for the new initiative that night, their college brochure review temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the new project. As they worked side by side, Richard marveled at how naturally they collaborated. Michael's compassionate insight complementing his own strategic thinking, just as Sarah's heart had once balanced his ambition. We make a good team, he commented as midnight approached and they finally gathered up their notes. Michael grinned, stretching his arms above his head to work out the kinks from hours of brainstorming. Well, we do share some DNA, he joked. Richard laughed, but there was a deeper truth in the observation. Their connection went beyond genetics. It was built on shared values, mutual respect, and the unique bond that had formed when two lives that should have always been intertwined finally found their way to each other. As they said goodnight and headed to their respective rooms, Richard paused in the hallway, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. A visual timeline of their years together, with Sarah's image interspersed throughout, keeping her presence alive in their home. Thank you, he whispered to her smiling face in one particular photo, taken during her medical school graduation. For everything. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, he could almost hear her voice in response, saying what she had always believed. Everything happens exactly as it should. The story of Richard and Michael Thompson eventually became more than just a private family narrative. As Sarah's Bridge grew into an internationally recognized organization, reuniting hundreds of families separated by circumstance, disaster, or misunderstanding, journalists inevitably became interested in its origins. At first, Richard was reluctant to share something so personal. But Michael, now a poised and articulate college student, convinced him that their experience could inspire others. People need to know that miracles still happen, he argued. That sometimes, the thing you've been missing your whole life could be just around the corner. And so, on the 10th anniversary of their chance meeting, they gave their first joint interview to a major news outlet. The resulting article, titled "The Prayer That Changed Everything," went viral almost immediately, touching hearts around the world with its message of hope, connection, and second chances. Richard was unprepared for the flood of responses. Thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of unexpected reunions, missed connections, and the mysterious ways that separated lives sometimes find their way back to each other. You see? Michael said as they read through the comments together. Everyone has a version of our story inside them, the deep human need to find where we belong. The interview led to speaking engagements, which led to a book deal, which eventually resulted in a documentary film chronicling not just Richard and Michael's story, but several others facilitated by Sarah's Bridge. Richard, once intensely private about his personal life, found himself embracing this new role as a storyteller and advocate. If sharing our experience helps even one child find their family, it's worth any discomfort, he explained when friends expressed surprise at his willingness to step into the public eye in such a personal way. What he didn't say, but what Michael understood, was that this was also Richard's way of honoring Sarah, ensuring that her compassion and wisdom continued to ripple outward into the world, touching lives she would never meet. At the film's premiere, there wasn't a dry eye in the house when the final scene showed Richard and Michael sitting on the curb outside Luigi's, sharing a meal exactly as they had done on that first day, coming full circle in their extraordinary journey. As the credits rolled and the audience rose in a standing ovation, Richard felt Michael's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly. No words were necessary between them. They both knew that some bonds transcend explanation. They simply exist, waiting to be discovered when the time is right. On Michael's 21st birthday, Richard presented him with a special gift, a small carved wooden box that had belonged to Sarah. "She would want you to have this now," Richard said, placing it in his son's hands. Michael opened it carefully to find a collection of items that told the story of his parents' relationship. Ticket stubs from their first date, pressed flowers from a bouquet Richard had given Sarah after a fight, a handwritten letter never sent. At the bottom was a journal, its pages filled with Sarah's elegant handwriting. "She started writing this when she found out she was pregnant with you," Richard explained softly. "It was her way of making sure you would know both of us, even if we couldn't be together." Michael ran his fingers over the cover reverently before opening to the first page. "Dear little one," he read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion, evident in his eyes. "Today I found out that you exist, and already you have changed everything. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I promise you this. You will always be loved, completely and unconditionally, by both your father and me, even if circumstances keep us apart." Michael looked up at Richard, tears shining in his eyes. "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow, she always knew we would find each other." Later that night, after the birthday celebrations had ended and the guests had gone home, Richard found Michael sitting on the balcony, Sarah's journal open in, his lap illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights. "She was amazing," Michael said without looking up as Richard joined him. "The way she writes about you, about me, about life. It's like she could see the bigger picture even when things were at their darkest." Richard nodded, settling into the chair beside his son. "That was Sarah," he agreed. "She always had faith that things would work out as they should, even when all evidence pointed to the contrary." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thoughts of the woman who connected them. Finally, Michael closed the journal carefully and turned to his father. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after graduation," he said. Richard raised an eyebrow, interested. Michael had been considering several paths, from medicine like his mother to business like his father. "And?" Richard prompted when Michael paused. His son smiled, a determined light in his eyes that Richard recognized from his own reflection. "I want to expand Sarah's bridge," Michael said decisively. "Take it to the next level, not just reuniting families, but preventing separations in the first place. Policy work, systemic change, addressing root causes." Richard felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost overwhelming. This was Sarah's true legacy, not just their son, but the compassion and vision that lived on through him. "That sounds like a worthy challenge," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And completely in line with what your mother would have wanted." Michael nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "I know it won't be easy," he acknowledged. "Changing systems never is. But I've had a pretty good example of what one person with determination can accomplish." He glanced at his father with a small smile, and Richard felt humbled by the reference. From his perspective, everything good in Michael came from Sarah. Her kindness, her integrity, her unwavering belief in the potential for good in the world. But perhaps he had contributed something worthwhile as well. Persistence, strategic thinking, the courage to challenge established norms when necessary. Together, those qualities made Michael uniquely equipped to take on the ambitious goals he was setting for himself. "Whatever you decide to do," Richard said, reaching over to squeeze his son's shoulder, "know that I'm behind you 100%. Resources, connections, advice, whatever you need." Michael's smile widened. "I know, Dad," he said simply. "You've never let me down." As Richard prepared for bed that night, he found himself drawn to the photograph of Sarah that had always occupied his nightstand, a candid shot taken during their college days, her head thrown back in laughter at something now forgotten. "Our boy is growing up," he told her image softly. "You'd be so proud of him, Sarah. He has your heart and your vision." Richard had never been one for talking to photographs, but tonight it felt right, necessary even. "I wish you could see him," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "The man he's becoming, the good he's going to do in the world." He paused, emotion making it difficult to continue for a moment. "I wish..." But there were too many wishes to articulate, too many lost possibilities to name. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for finding a way to bring us together. I don't know how you did it, but I know you had a hand in it somehow." As he placed the photograph back on the nightstand and turned out the light, Richard thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had led him to this moment. A life richer and more meaningful than he ever could have imagined, all because of a hungry boy's prayer and a name spoken in faith. In the darkness, he smiled. Some might call it coincidence, others might call it destiny, but Richard knew what it really was. It was Sarah, still taking care of her family, even from beyond.